A first-class seat didn't stop the flight attendant from insulting the black CEO's family mid-air. Not knowing the sky itself answered to Big Shaq. Whispers turned to laughter. Service turned to shade, until the cabin learned who really owned the airline. One quiet man, one powerful name, and a reckoning at 30,000 feet that no one saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun poured through the vast windows of the airport terminal, casting golden ribbons across the polished floors, as Big Shaq walked calmly toward Gate 23. Beside him, Mara tugged her small carry-on, her eyes wide with excitement. Lucille, dignified as ever, moved with quiet grace, while Shawnee kept a steady, protective glance over them all. Shaq's broad shoulders drew glances, murmurs fluttering like restless birds through the crowd. Even in his casual sweats, he was unmistakable. The giant of basketball, the heart of countless charity drives, the man whose name lit up arenas and headlines alike. But today, Shaq wasn't an icon. Today he was simply a father, a son, an ex-husband, a man eager for a family getaway. They were flying to Maui, a long overdue escape from the public eye, from the endless demands, from the weight of a life lived under scrutiny. Shaq had chosen this airline purposefully, one he had invested in during its darkest days, helping it rise to prosperity again. But he'd told no one here. No special treatment, no announcements, just peace. As they approached the boarding line for first class, the ripple began. A group of sharply dressed business people exchanged smirks. A teenage boy elbowed his friend with a wide grin, and a middle-aged woman leaned toward her husband, whispering as her eyes flicked to Shaq's massive frame. Shaq smiled softly, not meeting their gazes, his mind on the waves and sunshine waiting ahead. Boarding began. As they reached the front, the first-class attendant, Madison, intercepted them with a tight-lipped smile. Her perfectly polished blonde hair and crisp uniform spoke of control, precision, and authority, but the cold flicker in her blue eyes told another story. "Sir," Madison said smoothly, her voice just shy of patronizing, "I think you're in the wrong line. Coach is over there." Shaq handed over their boarding passes, without a flicker of irritation. Madison's eyes flicked down, her smile tightening further, as the unmistakable first class blazed from the paper. For a beat, she said nothing. Then, forced, she gestured them through. "Enjoy your flight," she murmured, turning quickly away. The family settled into their plush leather seats, Mara beaming as she explored the buttons and compartments. Lucille set her handbag in her lap, eyes narrowing as she watched Madison breeze by without so much as offering them a pre-flight drink. Shawnee caught Lucille's glance and gave a tight shake of her head. They weren't here to make a scene. Shaq leaned back, stretching his legs with practiced ease, but his mind wasn't as relaxed. He felt the shift in the cabin, the subtle change in atmosphere, as whispers stirred behind raised magazines, as glances darted and retreated. The man across the aisle, silver-haired and sharp-suited, gave a thin-lipped smirk. A couple in their 40s giggled softly, their eyes darting toward Shaq's row. Madison returned, gliding past with a tray of champagne flutes, smiling warmly at the other passengers. When she reached Shaq's row, her arm lowered slightly, her voice cool. "Would you like something non-alcoholic?" she asked, not quite looking at them. Lucille's jaw tightened. Shawnee let out a long, slow breath through her nose. Mara shot her father a questioning look, her young face pinched with confusion. Shaq's heart twisted. He reached out, smoothing a massive hand over his daughter's curls, whispering a soft reassurance. He gave Madison a quiet, "No thanks," letting the moment pass. But inside, the weight grew heavier. As the flight took off, the unease didn't lift. Madison's attentiveness danced around their row like a deliberate omission. She refilled glasses with bright chatter, laughed with passengers, crouched to assist an elderly man with his bag. But when it came to Shaq's family, she barely offered eye contact. When Shawnee pressed the call button to ask for a blanket, Madison took nearly 20 minutes to appear, offering a clipped, "We're out right now," though fresh stacks sat in clear sight. Lucille caught Shaq's eye, her expression steeled, the years of dignity under pressure etched into the lines around her mouth. Shaq gave her the smallest shake of his head, a silent promise to handle it his way. But it wasn't just Madison. The passengers took their cue. A young man with a loosened tie stood in the aisle, pretending to stretch but casting amused glances down at Shaq. A woman 2 rows back made a loud comment about people these days buying their way into spaces they don't belong. Each word sank into Shaq like a stone, heavy and uninvited. Mimira leaned close. Daddy, why's everyone acting weird? Shaq wrapped his arm around her, pressing a kiss to her temple. Sometimes, baby, people just don't understand, he murmured, his voice low, steady, and heartbreakingly gentle. As the seatbelt light dimmed, Madison disappeared into the galley. Shaq heard the faint murmur of voices, the unmistakable tone of gossip. His ears, trained by years on the court to catch the smallest sound, picked up Madison's voice. Can you believe they're up here? Thought they'd be in coach for sure. The words weren't just careless. They were daggers. Yet Shaq sat, a mountain of stillness, absorbing the quiet insults, anchoring his family with his calm. He watched Shawnee's hands clench briefly, saw Lucille's brow furrow, and felt Mira's small fingers curl into his. But his decision was clear. No explosion. No confrontation. Not yet. The hours stretched, each minute thick with tension. Madison's behavior grew bolder. A scowl when Lucille asked for water, an exaggerated sigh when Shawnee requested headphones for Mayra. Shaq felt the slow burn under his skin, a lifetime of moments like this compressing into a single suffocating flight. But then, a shift. A nervous young attendant, Amber, tiptoed near. She whispered to Madison. A tight whisper Shaq barely caught. That's Shaquille O'Neal. He owns part of the airline, Madison. Madison stiffened, her face blanching. For a split second, her polished facade cracked, eyes darting to Shaq, lips parting in dawning horror. Shaq felt the change ripple through the air. But he remained motionless, offering only a faint smile to Amber, who retreated quickly. Mira shifted in her seat, sensing the current change without understanding its source. Lucille's expression softened, her eyes flicking knowingly toward Shaq. Shawnee exhaled, a ghost of a grin tugging at her lips. Still Shaq said nothing. Still he waited. The tension no longer simmered. It coiled, waiting to snap. And as the plane sliced through the clouds, Shaq knew the moment of reckoning was coming. Not with fists, not with fury, but with a quiet, unstoppable grace that would ripple far beyond this cabin. The audience, held tight in the slow draw of injustice, felt the air shift. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The cabin settled into its rhythm, a quiet hum of engines, hushed conversations, and the faint clink of glasses as the flight leveled at cruising altitude. Madison drifted through first class like a swan on water, poised, polished, and utterly indifferent. To the casual eye, she was flawless, a model of efficiency, all practiced smiles and polite tones. But to Shaq and his family, the chill behind that smile was unmistakable, a cold front that swept past their row again and again. Shaq leaned back in his seat, massive frame barely fitting, arms folded loosely across his chest. His dark eyes followed Madison as she fussed over the white couple seated across the aisle, refilling champagne flutes, adjusting headrests, laughing a touch too loudly at some idle joke. When she turned, her smile faded the moment it passed the invisible line between rows, replaced by the tight-lipped efficiency she reserved for the O'Neals. Mira fidgeted with her headphones, twisting the cord between her fingers. Daddy, she whispered, why doesn't she bring us drinks like the others? Shaq bent toward her, his deep voice a soft rumble. Only she could hear. Sometimes people get things wrong, baby. But we don't have to. He kissed her hair, and her small body relaxed against his side, though confusion still clouded her young eyes. Lucille sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the silver gleam of her wedding band catching the light. She had lived through enough to recognize the pattern thinly veiled disdain, the dismissive flick of eyes, the tightening of lips. A storm brewed behind her calm expression, but she kept it contained, her eyes fixed on Madison, as if willing her to falter. Shawnee, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued by nature, was a live wire in her seat. Her fingers tapped an impatient rhythm against the armrest. Her jaw clenched as she watched Madison sidestep their row again to offer warm cookies to the passengers up front. Shawnee had always been fierce when it came to her family, and her patience was fraying. But one glance at Shaq, calm and resolute, and she swallowed her words, pressing her lips into a thin, determined line. The air in first class thickened. Madison's microaggressions piled like snowflakes, each harmless on its own, but gathering into a drift of unmistakable hostility. She breezed by without taking their drink orders, replaced their linens late, responded to requests with clipped icy tones. A young businessman in a tailored suit leaned across the aisle, smirking as Madison lavished attention on him, his gaze flickering toward Shaq's row with a flicker of smug amusement. And Shaq? He absorbed it all, with the patience of a mountain. Inside, the pressure built, but his face gave nothing away, because Shaq had learned long ago that true power didn't need to announce itself. He watched, waited, his mind turning over the weight of history, the long chain of moments like this stretching back through his life, on the court, in boardrooms, at charity events, even in the simplest of daily tasks. But what Madison didn't know, what none of the passengers knew, was that Shaq wasn't just another wealthy celebrity in a first-class seat. He was a major shareholder in this airline, a key figure in its survival after near bankruptcy. Without his backing, Madison's polished uniform, this luxurious cabin, and the very jobs of her crew might not exist. And yet here he was, measured and silent, choosing to watch how far the contempt would go when unchecked. The flight wore on, meal service came, and with it fresh opportunities for Madison's careful neglect. She set trays down at their row without comment, forgetting napkins, ignoring the small routine kindnesses she bestowed so easily on others. Lucille's eyes flashed as she placed a gentle hand on Mira's back, whispering soft comforts. Shawnee shifted forward, about to rise, but Shaq placed one giant hand on her forearm, grounding her in place with the simplest of touches. Outside the cabin windows, clouds drifted past in soft, endless waves, a peaceful counterpoint to the tension crackling inside. Madison continued her performance, drifting effortlessly between charm and dismissal, her smile brightening only when white passengers called her over, her eyes flicking past Shaq's family like they were part of the furniture. And still Shaq waited. Through the soft narration of his thoughts, the audience glimpsed the layers beneath his stillness. Shaq remembered the sting of insults in his youth, the way coaches, reporters, even fans had underestimated him, belittled him, assumed the worst before knowing the first thing about him. He remembered the early years of fame, when security guards questioned his presence in VIP lounges, when sponsors smiled in public but bristled in private meetings, and he remembered the promises he had made to himself, to rise above it, to use his platform for good, to be the man his children could look up to without fear. The emotional storm swirled silently as the flight moved forward. Madison returned to the galley, laughing with another attendant, the two casting furtive glances toward Shaq's row. A younger crew member, Amber, lingered nearby, eyes darting nervously toward the family, her hands fidgeting with the edge of a tray. Amber saw what Madison refused to, saw the quiet dignity of a man who could crush the moment with a word and yet chose not to. In the cabin, the other passengers were waking up to the imbalance too. A middle-aged woman in a navy cardigan frowned as she watched Madison glide past Shaq's row, without refilling their drinks. A teenage boy across the aisle lowered his phone, his smirk fading as the pattern came into focus. The tension became its own kind of gravity, pulling eyes and shifting postures as the realization spread. This wasn't just bad service. This was something else. Shaq felt the shift, but he remained still. He squeezed Manera's shoulder gently, murmuring soft words of encouragement. Saw Lucille lift her chin just a fraction higher, saw Shawnee relax her clenched fists with a long exhale. The family had endured storms before. They would weather this one too. As the flight crossed over the vast expanse of the Midwest, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cabin. Madison emerged again, smoothing her apron, adjusting her hair, her smile fixed but her eyes betraying the slightest crack of discomfort. Amber hovered nearby, whispering something urgent into her ear. The audience could sense it. Something was shifting. Madison's steps faltered for just a moment, her smile flickering as Amber's words sank in. The weight of recognition pressed down, slow but inevitable, and the icy composure Madison wore like armor began to crack. And still Shaq waited, steady and unyielding, the calm at the center of a storm no one yet knew was coming. The stage was set. The players were in motion, and high above the clouds, at 30,000 feet, the truth hovered just out of reach, waiting for its moment to land. The plane cruised smoothly for a stretch, the steady drone of engines lulling some passengers into light naps, while others sipped cocktails or scrolled through their devices. Shaq sat still, his large hands folded on his lap, eyes half-lidded, appearing serene to anyone glancing his way. But inside, the storm was gathering strength. His muscles, honed from years of pushing through pressure, now tensed not for sport, but for patience. Madison's presence flickered in his peripheral vision, her movements sharp, her attention laser-focused, anywhere but his row. The first tremor of turbulence struck without warning. A jolt, quick and sharp, rattled glasses and caused overhead compartments to creak. Passengers straightened, alert but not alarmed. Madison emerged from the galley, a tray of drinks precariously balanced in her hands, navigating the aisle with the swaying confidence of a seasoned attendant. But as the plane jolted again, her heel caught on the edge of the carpet. The tray lurched, liquid sloshing toward Lucille like a silver wave. Lucille flinched as droplets spattered her blouse, the tray clattering just inches from her armrest. Madison's eyes flashed wide for a heartbeat, then cooled into a hard, defensive stare. Not a single word of apology crossed her lips. Instead, she flicked a cloth from her apron, dabbing at the tray, muttering about turbulence, and swept away without so much as acknowledging Lucille's startled face. Shoni leaned forward, her eyes sharp as blades. She didn't even apologize, she murmured under her breath, fury simmering just below the surface. Lucille, ever composed, reached for a napkin, patting her sleeve with slow, deliberate grace. Mira shrank against her father, her small hands gripping his massive arm. Shaq gently ran a hand down her back, murmuring soft reassurances only she could hear. But the cabin wasn't blind. A few passengers had witnessed the near spill, the lack of apology, the stiff retreat. One of them, a white man in a crisp navy suit across the aisle, cleared his throat loudly, drawing attention. "You people sure are sensitive, huh?" he said with a smirk, glancing at Lucille, then at Shaq. His voice was light, almost playful, but the sharp edge beneath it cut through the cabin's quiet. Shaq's heart squeezed. His fingers twitched against the armrest, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. This wasn't new. This was the world he had moved through his entire life. A world that loved to cheer his slam dunks but shrank from his humanity. A world quick to offer praise in public and scorn in private. He could feel the gaze of the cabin shift toward him, a ripple of tension humming in the air. Each passenger waiting, wondering, anticipating. Would Big Shaq rise? Would the giant thunder to his feet, unleash the power of his name, his money, his status? He closed his eyes for a breath, then another. In his mind the voices warred, one pushing for action, the other for patience. Shawnee's righteous anger simmered beside him. Lucille's quiet strength anchored him. Mira's innocent confusion tugged at his heart. And above them all, the image of his younger self hovered, a boy who had once dreamed of respect, not just recognition. The plane rocked again, more turbulence rattling the cabin, but it was nothing compared to the tremor inside Shaq's chest. He knew he could end this. With a word, a raised eyebrow, even a casual mention of his ownership, he could reduce Madison to apology, the smirking passenger to silence. But what would Mira learn from that? What example would he set if he met disdain with dominance? The man across the aisle chuckled, shaking his head as if Shaq's silence was weakness. Madison darted by again, her gaze briefly brushing Shaq's, flickering with something like triumph, before she snapped her attention to a row of white passengers, requesting blankets. Shaq's jaw tightened, the muscle feathering along his cheek. He adjusted his posture, resting his forearm across Mira's shoulder, drawing her close. A soft voice interrupted the tension. Amber, the young attendant, her face pale with anxiety, hovered near Shaq's row, her hands fidgeting with a tray. She offered water, her eyes darting nervously between Shaq, his family, and the smirking passenger. Shaq accepted the glass with a nod, his expression softening for the first time in what felt like hours. Amber's relief was almost visible as she retreated, a quiet witness to the storm brewing behind Madison's mask. The cabin settled again, the turbulence easing, but the emotional current remained charged. Shaq gazed out the window, the clouds thick and golden in the afternoon light, reflecting on all the moments that had shaped him. The jeers from fans in rival cities, the doubt in corporate boardrooms, the thinly veiled contempt in luxury spaces. All of it had trained him for this moment, had forged in him the quiet steel of restraint. He would not explode. He would not pull rank. He would not teach his daughter that power is measured by the ability to crush. Instead, he would show her the unseen weight of grace. The minutes crawled by. Madison returned. This time her steps slower, the first faint notes of uncertainty in her face. Amber must have spoken to her. Shaq could sense it in the subtle shift of posture, the slight hesitation as Madison paused near their row, but the damage was done, the cracks in the mask visible now to anyone looking closely. Shawnee let out a long breath, the tightness in her shoulders easing just a fraction. Lucille smoothed her blouse, reclaiming her dignity inch by inch. Mira, nestled against Shaq's side, gazed up at her father, eyes wide not with confusion now, but with a dawning realization that something important was unfolding, something bigger than spilled drinks and snide comments. The man in the navy suit shifted in his seat, the smirk slowly fading, as he sensed the shift in atmosphere. Around him, other passengers exchanged glances, some embarrassed, some thoughtful, some pointedly looking away. The weight of Shaq's presence was no longer just physical. It was moral, undeniable, reshaping the air in the cabin, without a single raised voice. Shaq closed his eyes again, drawing in a slow breath. He felt the plane steady beneath him, the engines rumble a steady heartbeat. The moment was not over, not yet, but when it came, the reckoning, the twist, the turn, he would meet it with the same calm power that had carried him through the fiercest battles of his life. And above all, he would teach by example. The quiet hum of the plane masked most sounds, but not all. In the galley at the back of first class, behind the curtain meant to separate staff from passengers, Madison leaned against the counter, arms folded, lips curled in a smirk, as she spoke in low tones to a fellow flight attendant. Her words were soft but sharp-edged, slicing through the hum of the engines, as she glanced toward the front cabin. "I just don't get why they're here," Madison murmured. Her voice dipped in disdain. "I mean, first class used to mean something, didn't it? Now anyone with a flashy name and a basketball can waltz in." She chuckled, a brittle sound, as the other attendant, a woman named Krista, shifted uncomfortably, casting a nervous glance toward the closed curtain. "Honestly," Madison continued, "they stick out like sore thumbs. You know the type. Loud, demanding, entitled, just waiting for them to pull the celebrity card." Unseen by Madison, Amber, the youngest attendant on the flight, lingered near the beverage cart, hands trembling slightly, as she stacked cups. She chewed at her bottom lip, anxiety pinching her brow, eyes darting toward the curtain as if she could see through it. Amber knew the truth Madison clearly didn't. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a passenger with a big name. He was the man who had saved the airline from collapse, the man whose investment had safeguarded jobs like Madison's, Krista's, and her own. Amber's heart pounded. She had wanted to say something all flight, but fear kept her rooted in place. She'd watched the little cruelties pile up, watched Madison's practiced charm evaporate when it came to the O'Neals, watched the ripple effect spread through the cabin. Now hearing Madison's whispered contempt, the knot of guilt inside her chest tightened to near breaking. At the front of the plane, Shaq's eyes were half closed, his massive form slouched in a seat that still seemed too small for him. But his ears, sharp from a lifetime of reading arenas, picked up the faintest threads of sound from the back. He couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. He didn't need the details. He could feel the shape of it, the contempt that had hung in the air since boarding. The quiet dismissals turned to whispered ridicule. Lucille sat stiff-backed beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes sharp and knowing. Shawnee, just across the aisle, shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming an impatient rhythm against the armrest. Mira, nestled against her father's side, had long ago stopped trying to understand, content just to be close to the steady, unshakable presence that was Shaq. The tension stretched taut like a wire, ready to snap. Amber took a slow, shaky breath, then moved. Step by quiet step, she made her way up the aisle, tray in hand, eyes flicking to Shaq's row. As she neared, her gaze caught his, and for a heartbeat, she froze. Her lips parted, a whisper of panic flickering across her face, and then she dipped her head slightly, as if to apologize without words. Shaq, without moving his shoulders, gave her the smallest nod, a quiet signal, a silent reassurance that settled the quake in her chest. It was a moment unseen by most, but Amber felt its weight, the way it lifted her spine and steadied her hands. She moved on, the tray trembling a little less, the air around her a little clearer. The plane shuddered again, a fresh wave of turbulence rolling through the cabin. Glasses rattled, silverware clinked, and a collective murmur rose from the passengers as they clutched armrests and glanced nervously at the ceiling. The seatbelt sign pinged to life, and Madison's voice floated from the intercom, smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence. Please remain seated, and fasten your seatbelts." But the real turbulence wasn't in the skies, it was inside the cabin, a storm of emotion swirling beneath the surface. Shaq's fingers tightened briefly on the armrest, his jaw working as he stared out the window at the sea of clouds. His thoughts raced. memories flashing across his mind like a highlight reel. The locker rooms where his presence was doubted, the meetings where his voice was dismissed, the endorsements where his image was curated but his ideas ignored. The weight of grace, of holding himself steady against waves of assumption, bore down on him with fresh force. Lucille reached over, resting her hand lightly on his forearm. No words passed between them, but the look they exchanged carried the history of 1,000 such moments, years of resilience, of teaching, of surviving with dignity and tact. Shawnee caught the glance, her own shoulders loosening just slightly, the fight in her eyes softened by understanding. Amber disappeared briefly behind the curtain, only to emerge moments later with a fresh tray of water. Her hands still shook faintly as she approached Shaq's row, but her voice was steadier. "Here you go, sir," she murmured, setting the glass down with careful precision, a flicker of apology warming her eyes. Shaq accepted it with a small nod, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to ease her nerves. In the galley, Madison's voice had gone quiet, the laughter fading into an uneasy silence as the weight of Amber's whispers finally reached her. The awareness crept in slowly, a realization that prickled at the edges of her composure. Madison's practiced charm was a mask, and now, piece by piece, it was slipping. The turbulence outside eased, the plane settling into smoother air, but inside the tension only thickened. The passengers sensed it, shifting in their seats, glancing curiously toward Shaq's row, the mood in first class bending towards something uncertain, unresolved. The stage was set for a reckoning, the moment when grace and power would collide, and the audience leaned forward, waiting to see which would break first. Shaq sipped his water slowly, his gaze drifting across the cabin, taking in the faces, the folded hands, the anxious glances, the restless feet. He could feel the moment approaching, the moment when his silence would no longer be enough, when the quiet storm he had weathered with patience would turn, not with thunder but with the unmistakable force of truth. In that space between turbulence and calm, between dignity and confrontation, Shaq waited, and the plane high above the world flew on, the storm outside fading, but the one inside still gathering, still readying for the moment when everything would change. The cabin lights dimmed, as the evening sky beyond the windows darkened into a deep indigo, streaked with the last embers of sunlight. Passengers settled into a hushed rhythm, some reclining, some flicking through in-flight movies, while a hush stretched over first class like a taut waiting silence. Shaq sat still, one large hand resting over Mara's smaller one, his eyes on the faint reflection of his face in the window. His mind was far away, wrestling with a tension he knew too well, the push and pull between standing tall and staying silent. Shawnee leaned across the aisle, her voice low but urgent. "Shaq," she murmured, her eyes sharp, her jaw tight. "How long are you going to let this go on?" Her words weren't loud, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Lucille, seated beside Shaq, flicked her gaze to Shawnee, then to her son, but stayed quiet. Shawnee's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. "You've been patient, baby, I know, but she's walking all over us. What does that teach Maura? That it's okay to let people treat us like this?" Shaq drew a slow breath, eyes never leaving the window. He felt the truth of Shawnee's words press into his chest like a stone. It wasn't that he didn't see the injustice. He saw it in every clipped word from Madison, every sneer from the passengers, every little humiliation layered like dust across the hours. But inside him, humility had long been his armor. It was what his mother had taught him, what his upbringing in Newark had carved into his bone. Maura, shifting in her seat, looked up at her father with puzzled eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice carrying that raw childlike vulnerability. "Why are they being so mean to us? What did we do wrong?" The question landed like a blow, sharp and clean. Shaq turned, brushing a hand over her curls, his throat thick, heart twisting with a deep ache. No championship ring, no endorsement deal, no billion-dollar fortune could ease. In his mind, a flood of memories unfurled. He saw himself as a boy on the cracked streets of Newark, a towering, awkward kid before the world knew his name. He remembered the shopkeepers who followed him through the aisles, the teachers who assumed he wouldn't keep up, the sideways glances on sidewalks and buses. He remembered the day his mother sat him down at the kitchen table, her voice calm but fierce, and said, "You can't control how they see you, baby, but you can control how you carry yourself." That lesson had shaped his life, had been his compass as the world rushed to embrace his fame, but stumbled over his skin. Rising to the top, he had clung to kindness, to humility, Not because he was blind to prejudice, but because he refused to let it define him. But now, as Mara's wide eyes searched his face for answers, Shaq felt the thirst prickling doubt. When does humility stop being strength and start feeling like chains? Shawnee's hand covered her mouth briefly, then dropped. I just don't want her growing up thinking this is normal, she whispered. Lucille's hand moved, slow and deliberate, to rest on Shaq's shoulder, the same comforting weight she'd offered since he was a child. It steadied him, but it didn't lighten the burden. Across the cabin, Madison's movements sharpened. She was busy at the service station near the cockpit, fiddling with the intercom, the corners of her mouth twitching, as she shot glances toward Shaq's row. Amber hovered at her side, eyes darting nervously, lips pressed tight in a thin line of worry. Shaq's gaze sharpened as he watched the scene unfold. He knew that look. He'd seen it in boardrooms, in media interviews, on the faces of men who smiled while sharpening their knives. Madison was preparing something, and it wasn't an apology. The cabin jolted slightly as the plane adjusted altitude, a subtle but unmistakable shift. Madison leaned forward, pressing the intercom button, her polished voice crackling through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, and even without hearing the rest, Shaq's gut tightened. He sensed it, the slow, practiced cruelty of someone about to dress up a humiliation as a formality. Shaq squeezed Miura's hand gently, drawing strength from the small weight against his side. His eyes flicked to Lucille, then to Shawnee. They were watching him, waiting, not for an explosion, not for a scene, but for a decision. His breath came slow, deep, measured, as the words poured from Madison's mouth. We've been informed, Madison said smoothly, that due to an earlier seating error, we will need to relocate some passengers to balance the cabin for safety. Her eyes flicked deliberately toward Shaq's row, her voice laced with a practiced sweetness that made Shawnee's fingers curl into fists. We'll be assisting those passengers shortly. The air in first class chilled. A ripple of whispers stirred among the passengers. The man in the navy suit smirked, murmuring to his seatmate. Shaq's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest, his body still as stone. He felt the weight of every eye, the coiling tension that had wound tighter with each hour, now pressing down on his chest. Inside, Shaq's mind split. One half the warrior, the competitor who knew how to seize a moment. The other half the son of Lucille, the father of Myra, the man who had learned that not every battle needed to be fought with noise. He saw himself reflected in Myra's gaze, felt the challenge in Shawnee's stare, sensed the quiet faith in Lucille's touch. For a heartbeat, Shaq closed his eyes, and in that stillness, a quiet clarity bloomed. He understood the stakes were no longer about Madison, about first class, or even about the passengers who waited to watch him snap. It was about what legacy he wanted to carve into this moment. For his daughter, for his family, for every unseen person who had ever been made small in a space meant to uplift. He opened his eyes, the quiet storm in his chest settling into something unshakable. Madison's voice carried on over the speakers, cool and composed, but the tide had shifted. Shaq felt it in the slight stiffening of Amber's posture, in the uneasy shuffling of passengers, in the way Lucille straightened her spine and Shawnee exhaled through her nose. The moment Madison thought she was orchestrating was no longer hers to control, and as the cabin hummed with rising tension, Shaq prepared, not to fight back, but to rise, because sometimes, humility is mistaken for weakness. But in the right hands, at the right moment, it is the quietest, most unbreakable kind of strength. The cabin's soft hush was punctuated by the faint clink of ice in glasses, the shuffle of slippers against carpet, the low murmur of conversation drifting through first class. The sun had nearly dipped beyond the curve of the earth, and the cabin lights glowed in gentle gold. Shaq sat still, a quiet mountain in his seat, while Mimera rested her head against his arm, eyes heavy-lidded but restless. Lucille sat tall and proud, the years of endurance etched into her elegant posture, while Shawnee's jaw worked tight, her fingers flexing in small, agitated bursts. Then it happened. The sudden, sharp crackle of the intercom sliced through the cabin like a blade, cutting the piece to ribbons. Madison's voice, cool and honeyed, rolled through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? She began, her tone smooth as glass, yet to Shaq's family it bristled with something pointed, something rehearsed. We've been informed of a seating adjustment required for safety reasons. Madison continued, eyes flicking toward Shaq's row with a flash of satisfaction. Unfortunately, due to an earlier reservation error, We will need to relocate some passengers to the rear of the aircraft. Shaq felt the stillness hit the cabin like a sudden vacuum. The oxygen sucked out of the space. The low hum of conversation died mid-sentence. Forks paused mid-air. Every head turned as if yanked by an invisible string. Madison's gaze lingered on the O'Neal's row just long enough to make the message clear without saying it outright. Lucille's fingers curled around the armrests, her mouth tight but silent. Shawnee's breath hissed through clenched teeth, her eyes flashing with a fury she barely restrained. Mira stirred, blinking up at her father, confusion furrowing her small brow. Shaq's chest expanded on a slow, deep inhale. Time seemed to stretch as he unbuckled his seatbelt with deliberate calm, the faint click sounding louder than it should in the heavy quiet. He rose, towering over the cabin like a monument, his presence filling the space without a word. His head brushed the overhead compartment, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow as he turned toward Madison, who stood near the galley, arms folded, a thin smile tugging at her lips. For a heartbeat the air held its breath. Then Shaq spoke, his voice a low, even rumble, carrying the weight of restraint and unshakable poise. "We're fine where we are," he said, each word measured, his eyes fixed calmly on Madison. The effect rippled through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, some exchanging wide-eyed glances, others sinking into their headrests with smirks curling at the corners of their mouths. A murmur swept through the rows, half curiosity, half uneasy amusement. Some passengers craned to whisper to their seatmates. Others watched with the barely concealed anticipation of spectators at a spectacle. Lucille exhaled slowly, her shoulders softening, though the pinch of pain at the corners of her eyes remained. Shawnee leaned forward, her elbows braced on her knees, lips pressed into a tight, proud line. Mira, wide-eyed, clutched the hem of Shaq's jacket, her small voice barely a whisper. "Daddy." Shaq looked down, meeting her gaze with a smile so gentle it momentarily softened the storm in the room. He reached out, smoothing a hand over her hair, a silent reassurance that grounded them both. Madison's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. She straightened, folding her hands at her waist, the picture of polished authority. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying the faintest edge of false politeness, "we'll need your cooperation for the safety of all our passengers." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "We're fine," he repeated, calm as stone. The murmurs thickened. A woman a few rows ahead cast a sympathetic glance over her shoulder. A man at the window, however, snorted softly, muttering under his breath. "Well, someone thinks they're special." Another chuckled quietly, the sound small but sharp, slicing through the tension like a razor. Madison's face flushed, the slightest pink blooming at her collarbone, as she realized her authority was slipping, her plan unraveling. She turned briskly on her heel, disappearing momentarily into the galley, where Amber hovered, her face pale and stricken, fingers twisted in the hem of her apron. In that pocket of hush, the O'Neals sat in a silence heavy with heartbreak and grace. Lucille reached across the aisle, her fingertips brushing Shawnee's arm, a silent transmission of comfort. Shawnee bit down hard on the words at the back of her throat, her fists loosening just enough to smooth Mira's curls with trembling fingers. Shaq lowered himself back into his seat, the leather creaking softly under his weight. He folded his hands in his lap, his gaze distant, as if measuring the years that had brought him here. From blacktop courts in Newark to NBA arenas, from the roar of fans to the hush of this cabin, from every moment he'd chosen to rise above, to this moment where grace had become both shield and burden. Around them, the passengers remained caught in the rippling aftermath. A young couple exchanged uneasy glances, whispering behind hands. A teenager who had been watching movies pulled out earbuds, eyes flicking nervously toward the front. Even the smirking man from earlier now watched with a hint of something sharper in his gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or a creeping discomfort. In the galley, Madison steadied herself, smoothing her uniform, her hands trembling just slightly as she reached for the intercom again. Amber hesitated, her mouth opening as if to stop her, then closing just as quickly, her shoulders folding inward. Back in first class, Shaq felt the shift coming. He could sense the fracture in the air, the moment just before a storm breaks, when the wind changes and the sky tilts. The emotional gut punch had landed on his family, on the watching passengers, on the young attendant torn between her conscience and her fear. And as he sat there, silent but unbowed, the audience could feel it. The turn was coming. The weight of Madison's choices would crash back on her with the precision of gravity, and the arc of the moment, the long, patient curve of karma, was nearly complete. In that hush, as the engines hummed steady and the clouds rolled endlessly by, Shaq remained steady. He knew the reckoning was not his to deliver in anger. It would come all the same, and when it did, his family would rise. Not because they fought for their place, but because they had never surrendered it. Amber stood just inside the galley, her hands pressed flat against the counter, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She could hear Madison on the other side of the curtain, could feel the crackling tension in the cabin, the buzz of whispers swelling like a wave waiting to break. Her fingers trembled against the metal tray as her mind raced. She had held back long enough. With a sharp breath, she peeled herself away from the counter and slipped through the narrow opening, stepping into the aisle with a heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the hum of the engine. Madison was adjusting her uniform, smoothing her blonde hair, her polished smile flickering briefly as she prepared to step back into the lion's den. But Amber intercepted her, planting herself firmly in her path, eyes wide, mouth dry. For a beat, neither spoke. Then Amber's voice, shaky but determined, broke through. "Madison, we need to talk," she whispered, glancing toward Shaq's row, where the O'Neals sat quiet, the eye of the storm they hadn't asked to enter. Madison lifted an eyebrow, the condescension practiced and effortless. "Amber, I'm in the middle of—" Amber's voice sharpened, low but cutting. "That's Shaquille O'Neal." Madison froze, the words hanging in the narrow space like a detonated secret. Her eyes flicked to Shaq's seat, her smirk wavering at the edges. Amber pressed on, her throat tightening. "He's not just a basketball player, he's the one who kept this airline alive after bankruptcy. The one who gave all of us a job. You're about to humiliate the person who saved this company." Madison's face drained of color, the blood rushing from her cheeks, as if pulled by gravity. The polished, composed mask cracked, her eyes darting wildly as the truth clawed its way through layers of denial. Her mouth opened, a weak sound escaping, but no words came. From behind the curtain, the captain's voice crackled over the internal crew channel, a low query about a possible issue in the cabin. Amber's shaky hands reached for the receiver, and for a brief second, she met Madison's panicked gaze. "You should tell him," Amber whispered, "or I will." Meanwhile, in the cabin, the atmosphere had thickened to the point of suffocation. Lucille sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her spine a rod of steel, her face lined with decades of quiet battles. Shoni rested one elbow on the armrest, her fingers against her lips, her dark eyes trained unflinchingly on the front of the plane. Mira had curled into Shaq's side, her fingers laced through his, head resting on his arm, comforted not by words, but by the unshakable steadiness of his presence. And Shaq remained the still center. His breath came slow and deep, his eyes soft when they fell on his family, his posture relaxed but alert. He felt the eyes on him, the hush that had fallen over the passengers, the mix of sympathy, curiosity, and unease. Yet there was no gloating in his heart, no fire in his chest, only the quiet ache of a man who had seen this before, too many times to count, who carried the weary knowledge that patience was sometimes the only shield against a world eager to misunderstand. Amber slipped back toward the cockpit, her voice low as she relayed what had unfolded, her fingers trembling on the intercom button. Madison stood frozen for a beat longer, then stumbled after her, her steps unsteady, the confidence drained from her walk. Behind them, passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the tremor under the surface, whispering soft questions, exchanging knowing glances. Shaq reached over, brushing a thumb over Mira's forehead, the warmth of his palm soothing the crease of worry between her brows. Lucille turned just slightly, her eyes flickering toward her son, a quiet pride in their depths, though the weariness of old scars never quite faded. Shani exhaled slowly, the tension bleeding from her shoulders, but the sharpness in her gaze didn't dull. Not yet. Madison reappeared moments later, her face pale, the smile stripped away, her hands fluttered briefly at her sides, as if unsure what to do, before she clasped them tightly in front of her. For the first time on that long flight, she looked directly at Shaq, not past him, not around him, but at him. Her mouth opened, then closed, a breath catching in her throat. But before she could force the apology that hovered there, the captain emerged from the cockpit, his crisp uniform and calm demeanor filling the aisle with a very different kind of authority. His eyes swept the cabin, his expression professional but not cold. And then he approached Shaq's row with the measured step of a man who understood the gravity of the moment. Shaq rose slowly, towering once again in the narrow space, his broad frame casting a shadow across the aisle. The captain extended his hand, his voice quiet but firm. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, "on behalf of the airline, thank you for flying with us today. I'm deeply sorry for any inconvenience you've experienced." There it was, the shift, the pivot point the entire cabin had been unconsciously waiting for. The passengers leaned forward slightly, their murmurs softening, curiosity tilting towards something gentler. Madison hovered near the galley, her hands twisting the edge of her apron, her eyes darting between the captain and Shaq, the enormity of her miscalculation sinking deeper with each passing second. Shaq shook the captain's hand with quiet grace, his voice low, unembellished. "Thank you, Captain," he said. "We're all right." No speech, no call-out, no victory lap, only a simple statement, an affirmation that while the storm had raged around them, it hadn't touched the core of who they were. As he sat back down, Shaq felt the release in his chest, the slow exhale of a man who had carried the weight of dignity too long to be crushed by a single flight. Mayara leaned into him, her small voice threading into his ear. "You're amazing, Daddy." Lucille reached across and squeezed his hand. Shawnee let her tension dissolve into a faint smile, one that carried both relief and a fierce kind of pride. The cabin gradually unfroze, the tension softening into a different kind of silence, one that hummed not with suspense, but with the quiet understanding that something meaningful had just unfolded before their eyes. Madison retreated to the galley, her polished mask in ruins, while Amber remained near the curtain, her eyes bright with a strange mix of fear and hope. As the engines droned on, Shaq leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, feeling the peace ripple through his family, the balance restored not by force, but by a presence too large to be shaken, and a grace too profound to be ignored. The seatbelt sign chimed softly overhead, as the captain's voice filled the cabin, calm and clipped, announcing the start of descent. Passengers stirred from their half-sleep, closing laptops, straightening seats, murmuring quietly as the plane tipped its nose toward the distant glitter of the city below. But in first class, the air was thick with something electric, sharp with the residue of the storm that had passed, and not quite finished. Madison moved through the aisle, with the forced brightness of someone desperate to patch a sinking ship. Her eyes darted from face to face, her smile stretched too wide, her hands trembling just enough to betray her. She held a tray of champagne, the crystal flutes catching the dim cabin light, and paused near Shaq's row, the tension in her shoulders almost audible. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, her voice falsely sweet, "please accept this with our compliments." She held out the glass with both hands, the gesture stiff, unnatural, rehearsed in the short, panicked minutes she'd spent hidden in the galley. Shaq lifted his gaze, his dark eyes steady, unreadable, the faintest trace of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "No thank you," he murmured, his voice soft but unmistakably firm. The rejection landed like a silent slap, its sting sharpened by the very grace with which it was delivered. Madison's fingers twitched on the tray, her mouth opening and closing, no words quite ready to surface. Shawnee leaned back, arms crossed, her eyes narrowing with a look so blistering it stripped the last of Madison's confidence away. It was the kind of look that didn't need words, didn't need volume. It was pure, unapologetic fire, honed over years of protecting what mattered. Lucille, ever the master of understated elegance, offered only a small tilt of her head and a quiet remark under her breath, as Madison turned. "Some lessons come late," she said softly, but just loud enough to reach Madison's ear. Mayra watched it all unfold, wide-eyed but silent, the weight of the moment settling into her like a stone she didn't yet know how to carry. She looked up at her father, searching his face, reading the calm there, the steady composure that had not once cracked from the first insult to this trembling apology. Shaq caught her gaze and gave her a faint, reassuring nod, his hand resting over hers, anchoring her to something solid in the shifting air. Madison stumbled back, her tray wobbling slightly, and she retreated down the aisle with the brittle movements of someone unraveling. Behind her, the cabin stirred. A man in a window seat, who had chuckled earlier, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smirk faltering. The woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly, as if wanting to say something, then stopped herself, her expression sober. A quiet murmur moved through the rows, less laughter now, more a ripple of awareness, of realization that the quiet giant in seat 3A was far more than the caricature they'd assumed. Shaq, sensing the shift, did something no one expected. He turned his broad shoulders, leaned into the aisle, and offered a smile, not to Madison, not to the crew, but to the passengers around him. A small, warm nod to the older couple, across the aisle. A gentle grin at the young man in the corner who looked away too quickly. A light comment to the nervous mother juggling a toddler 2 rows up. It was subtle, almost effortless, and yet it changed the air, softened it, lifted it. It was as though Shaq had decided that while some people's pride would descend with the plane, he would help lift the rest. The final minutes of the flight unfolded in a hush laced with tension. Madison moved robotically, eyes down, every practiced smile now a crack in her mask. Amber remained close by, her presence steady, a quiet shield against the unraveling of her senior colleague. The captain passed through briefly, murmuring final checks, his eyes flicking once, meaningfully, toward Shaq's row. Lucille shifted in her seat, her hands smoothing the fabric of her dress. She offered Shawnee a small, knowing smile, one that spoke of battles fought long before this flight, of dignity carried through decades of slights and struggles. Shawnee exhaled, her arms unfolding, her hand moving instinctively to Mara's shoulder in a gesture both protective and proud. Shaq sat back, a quiet observer, his gaze sweeping the cabin, not with arrogance, not with anger, but with the easy authority of someone who no longer needed to prove a single thing. He felt the soft press of Mayara's head against his side, heard the slow, calming breath she took, sensed Lucille's steady presence beside him, and knew deeply fully that they had already won something far more valuable than a public apology. As the plane dipped lower, the wheels folding down with a low rumble, the city lights emerged from the dark, scattered across the earth like a spilled handful of stars. The passengers braced gently, the tension in the cabin thinning but not gone, the anticipation of landing pulling everyone's attention forward. But underneath the ordinary sounds, the thud of shoes on the floor, the clicks of seatbelts, the hum of the engines, there was another kind of suspense building, a sharper, quieter current running through first class. Madison's fate hovered unspoken between the passengers, the question of fallout dangling in the air like a cord waiting to snap. They all knew now, they all saw, and once they stepped off this plane, what had happened here would ripple outward, amplified by whispers, phones, and perhaps before long, headlines. Shaq felt it too, but he carried no triumph in his chest. Only a quiet, steady heartbeat, the pulse of a man who had learned the value of stillness, of patience, of dignity worn like armor. As the landing gear touched down and the wheels met the earth with a shuddering embrace, Shaq squeezed Mara's hand once, a soft pressure of reassurance. Outside the windows, the runway lights streaked by in a blur, the city waiting just beyond the glass, and inside in the narrow aisle of first class, the descent of pride continued. One woman unraveling, one family rising, and an entire cabin left to reckon with what they had witnessed at 30,000 feet. The plane touched down with a soft but decisive thud, the wheels kissing the runway and sending a muted shudder through the cabin. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the passengers shifted in their seats, stretching stiff limbs and glancing at phones lighting up with signals freshly reconnected. First class remained unusually quiet though, the hush thick with the aftermath of what had unfolded over the past hours. The usual bustle of landing, bags tugged from overhead bins, jackets shrugged on, children jostled awake, felt muted under the weight of everything unsaid. Shaq sat still, his large frame calm, his hand resting on Mara's shoulder, as she leaned into him with sleepy trust. Lucille smoothed the hem of her dress with elegant fingers, eyes sharp but soft, her chin tilted high. Shawnee exhaled, shifting her posture from tension to composed readiness, her gaze flicking briefly to the window where airport lights shimmered against the dark. What none of them saw yet, but what waited just beyond the glass, was the ripple their journey had sent into the world. Amber moved quietly through the cabin, eyes darting between passengers, her face pale but set with determination. Madison, on the other hand, was unraveling by the minute. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands fidgeting at her sides, the carefully polished aura of control shattered beyond repair. She caught sight of her reflection in the polished door of the galley and flinched. Somewhere along the flight she had slipped from composed professional to panicked antagonist, and now she could feel the walls closing in. The captain's voice came over the speakers, warm and smooth. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. Local time is 7:24 p.m., and we'll be taxiing to the gate shortly. We ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we come to a complete stop. Thank you for flying with us." Madison half-heartedly murmured the standard announcements, her voice shaking as she added, "We hope you enjoyed your flight." The irony hung heavy in the air. What Madison hadn't counted on, what neither she nor the murmuring passengers had foreseen, was that the story unfolding in first class had already slipped past the cabin walls. A teenage passenger had been live tweeting the unfolding drama. Another had posted a short video. By the time the wheels touched the ground, hashtags were trending, media vans were en route, and airline executives were frantically dialing phones. As the doors opened and the walkway connected, Shaq rose slowly, unfolding his body from the seat like a mountain rising. He moved with unhurried grace, gathering Mimira's small carry-on, offering Lucille his arm, brushing a hand lightly against Shawnee's back. He felt the shift in the air as passengers turned, eyes wide not just with recognition now, but with the dawning realization that they had witnessed something far larger than a celebrity slighted in first class. Madison lingered by the galley, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. For a second her eyes met Shaq's, a raw flicker of panic flashing in her face. But Shaq offered only a small, calm nod, the barest curve of his mouth softening his features. There was no gloating in his expression, no sharpness in his gaze, only the same quiet dignity that had steadied him from the first insult to the last apology. Outside, the walkway teemed with movement. Airline executives in crisp suits clustered by the gate, whispering urgently into headsets. Beyond the terminal glass, a crowd had begun to gather. Cameras lifted, flashes cutting through the night, microphones held ready. Shaq paused for a moment, just inside the doorway, his family close around him, the pulse of anticipation thudding like a drumbeat in the air. The executives rushed forward, a flurry of apologies and outstretched hands. "Mr. O'Neal, we are so terribly sorry," one began, his words tumbling over themselves. "We had no idea. This is unacceptable. We want to make this right." Madison hovered just behind them, her eyes darting, her face pale, lips pressed thin as paper. Shaq raised one massive hand, and the chatter died. He turned slightly, his deep voice carrying through the gathered press, the crew, the murmuring passengers filtering off the plane behind him. "This isn't about me," Shaq said quietly, his tone gentle but sure. "It's not about celebrity. It's not about first class or coach, champagne or water. It's about respect." His gaze moved across the faces in front of him, the nervous executives, the humbled passengers, the trembling Madison, the hopeful Amber. "It's about how we treat people when we think no one's watching. It's about the choices we make in small moments that show who we really are." The crowd fell still. Cameras clicked, reporters leaned forward, but Shaq's focus never wavered. "I've spent a lifetime learning that strength isn't measured by how loud you are," he continued. "It's measured by how you carry yourself when it's hard, when it's unfair, when the easy thing to do is to strike back, and you don't." He paused, his hand tightening briefly on Mira's shoulder. "We can all do better," Shaq said softly. "Not just today, not just here. Every day, everywhere." Amber's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her fingers trembling as she clasped them together. Madison, pale and silent, looked down at her shoes, the weight of accountability settling heavy on her shoulders. Lucille lifted her chin a little higher, the faintest trace of a smile curving her mouth. Shawnee let out a quiet breath, her eyes locked on Shaq with fierce, proud love. Mira clung to his arm, wide-eyed, absorbing every word like they were being stitched into the fabric of who she would become. The executives murmured apologies again, but Shaq simply shook his head, his eyes kind but firm. "Take care of your people," he told them. "That's all I ask." And with that he turned, not toward the cameras, not toward the executives or the press, but toward the people who mattered most. He gathered his family close, wrapping one arm around Lucille's shoulders, resting the other hand lightly on Shawnee's back, guiding Mira by his side. Together they stepped into the terminal, their pace unhurried, their heads high, their hearts unbroken. Behind them, the airport buzzed with voices, cameras, flashes, and headlines already forming. But Shaq didn't look back. He didn't need to. His message had already landed, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the quiet, unstoppable force of grace. As they walked forward, past the crowd and into the bright, ordinary light of the terminal, Mira looked up at her father, her voice a whisper in the hum of the world around them. "Daddy," she murmured, "I'm proud of you." Shaq smiled, his heart full, his shoulders light, his legacy, in that moment, exactly what he had always hoped it would be. And in a world forever eager to measure a man by wealth, fame, or force, Shaq had shown them all. True power was found in the quiet strength to rise above. The headlines came first, splashed across social media, news tickers, and morning shows. Words like grace, dignity, humility threaded through countless stories as the public tried to capture what had unfolded at 30. Madison's face, once composed and unshakable, now stared out from screens in awkward freeze frames. Her polished smile wilted under the weight of public scrutiny. By the end of the week, the airline released its statement. Madison had been placed on immediate suspension, and the company was rolling out mandatory diversity and sensitivity training across all divisions. But it wasn't just about corporate consequences. In living rooms, break rooms, classrooms, and cafes, the story sparked conversations. Strangers who had been on that flight found themselves quoted in interviews, their words rippling outward. Some admitted their shame at watching in silence. Others praised the quiet strength they had witnessed. A few confessed they'd never seen power wielded so gently, so deliberately, without the need to dominate or humiliate in return. Meanwhile, Shaq had already stepped beyond the noise. At the Sunrise Youth Center, tucked away in a sun-baked corner of the city, laughter bounced off the cracked asphalt of the basketball court. Kids darted back and forth, sneakers squeaking, arms raised, voices lifting into the sky. Inside the gym, Shaq ducked his massive frame through the doorway, greeted by cheers and wide-eyed stares. He moved through the room like a familiar giant, clapping hands, ruffling hair, trading fist busts. But when the noise settled, when the kids gathered cross-legged on the floor, and the room quieted to a hush, Shaq lowered himself onto a folding chair and began to speak. He didn't tell them about the championships or the endorsements or the headlines. He didn't talk about fame or fortune, or the weight of celebrity. Instead, he spoke softly, weaving the story of that flight into a lesson far bigger than any moment captured by cameras. "See, it's easy to get loud," Shaq told them, his deep voice rolling through the room, gentle but resonant. "It's easy to stand up and show off when people come at you wrong. But the real power, that's when you know you could shut it all down, and you choose to stay calm instead." He glanced around the room, his eyes catching on young faces, leaning forward, drinking in every word. "There's gonna be moments," he continued, "when you walk into a room, and people already decided who you are before you open your mouth. Some of them will treat you small. Some will look right past you. And yeah, you're gonna feel that fire in your chest, like you gotta prove something. But listen, you don't owe anyone a performance. You owe yourself the kind of pride that doesn't need to scream." A boy near the front raised his hand, his voice thin but determined. "But what if they never see you different?" Shaq smiled, slow and wide, the kind of smile that softened the giant edges of his face. "That's their lesson to learn, not yours to carry." In the days following the flight, the ripple effect hadn't stopped at news coverage or corporate policy. It moved through families, through friendships, through communities. Parents talked to kids over dinner tables. Teachers folded it into classroom conversation. Strangers debated it in cafes, on subways, on street corners. In Madison, she sat alone in her apartment, the curtains drawn against the sun, scrolling through comment threads and news clips. For the first time in her career, the mirror reflected back more than a uniform. It showed her the cost of assumptions, the quiet damage of 1,000 small dismissals, the bruise her pride had left not only on others but on herself. At the airline headquarters, meetings ran late into the night. Executives shuffled papers, drafted statements, planned workshops, and weighed the delicate balance of public image and meaningful change. Some did it for optics, but others, stirred by the raw honesty of what had unfolded, began asking deeper questions. How had they built a culture where someone like Madison could thrive unchecked? Where had the quiet bystanders, passengers, crew, supervisors, learned to look away? Back at the youth center, Shaq wrapped up his talk, rising to his feet with the slow, effortless grace that came from a lifetime in his body. He led the kids onto the court, dribbling between them, laughing at their attempts to steal the ball, stooping to tie loose shoelaces, lifting smaller players toward the rim with a chuckle. When the sun dipped lower, streaking the sky with gold and pink, he gathered them once more, crouched low to meet their eyes. "Promise me something," Shaq said quietly. "When the world tries to tell you who you are, you show them with your heart, not your mouth. You show them with your grace, not your fists. That's how you win." The kids nodded. Some solemn, some grinning, all wide-eyed in the glow of a man whose fame was eclipsed only by the size of his spirit. As the evening deepened, Shaq slipped out the back, waving to parents arriving to collect their kids. He moved down the quiet sidewalk toward his car, his long shadow stretching out behind him. His phone buzzed with messages, media requests, speaking invitations, calls from sponsors and friends. But he let it hum in his pocket, the pull of the moment stronger than the lure of attention. In the final narration of this chapter, the audience is left with an image not of a man flexing his power, but of one gently passing it on. A man who understood that real change doesn't come from crushing your enemies, but from opening their eyes. A man who knew that leadership wasn't about walking into a room and owning it. It was about walking out of a room and leaving it better. As Shaq disappeared into the fading light, his legacy rippled outward, reaching far beyond the runway, beyond the airline, beyond the cabin where it all began. And in homes and hearts across the country, the story lived on, not as a scandal, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet, enduring reminder of what it looks like when greatness chooses compassion over ego, and when the biggest man in the room leads, not by towering over others, but by lifting them up. If this story stirred something in you, carry its message into your own spaces. Challenge the quiet biases, stand steady in the face of injustice, and choose grace when ego tempts you. Remember, real change doesn't need a stage, just a moment of courage. Be the person who leaves every room, every flight, every encounter better than you found it.